We've all imagined what it would be like to live in a nuclear apocalypse. And you know what? It's just such an interesting topic to think and talk about. So, I have decided to list every single thing you haven't considered about nuclear apocalypses, starting with the fact that you have not thought about initial survival enough. Survival. The first thing people completely misunderstand is how many humans would survive the initial nuclear strikes. Even in large-scale attacks, the majority of people wouldn't die instantly. They'd be outside major blast zones, sheltered by buildings underground, or simply far enough away to avoid immediate death. And surviving the explosion isn't winning anything. It's being signed up for something you didn't consent to. There wouldn't be a clear moment where everyone collectively realizes, okay, this is the apocalypse now. That's not how information works when communication collapses. You'd wake up and something would feel off. Phones wouldn't connect. Power would be out. The internet would be gone. News would be limited to rumors and emergency messages, while chaos burst through the streets. Most people would hold on to the hope that it would be temporary, that the power will come back, that help is coming, that someone somewhere is handling it, and that it would be just a bad couple of days. That assumption would kill a lot of people. Instead of conserving food, people would eat normally. Instead of staying put, they'd travel. Instead of adapting, they'd wait for some automatic solution to the problem. A similar reaction to an outage of power. Waiting only works if something is actually on the way. In this case, it wouldn't be. Help won't come and the solution isn't clear. Neither does it exist in the first place. And when that realization finally sinks in, panic doesn't explode all at once. It creeps in. First denial, then frustration, then fear. That slow buildup is what breaks most people. The lack of answers and false hope, collapsing. And that's just the physical side of survival. The psychological adjustment is where things get a lot darker and a lot harder to handle in such a stressful scenario. Letting go. Here's an uncomfortable truth about long-term survival. The people who struggle the most aren't the weakest or least skilled. They're the most attached. Attached to routines, comfort, and even the idea that the world they remember is coming back. Letting go isn't dramatic. There's no big speech or emotional breakthrough. It's a quiet decision people make when they stop expecting systems to recover, recognizing that their comfort no longer exists and that this new world won't be kind to them. People who can't let go keep planning their lives around a future that doesn't exist anymore. They save things for later, assume rules still matter, expect fairness and order, concepts that are no longer compatible with this new world. That delay is deadly, ruthless, and reckless. Survival favors people who accept discomfort early instead of fighting it emotionally, not in a depressing way, but in a practical and methodical one. They stop expecting life to feel normal. They stop measuring their situation like they still live in the past. They adapt instead of mourning for what is already lost. And no, that doesn't mean becoming heartless. It means being realistic about your situation, what helps you stay alive and what will only delay your survival. Survival isn't brave, courageous, or dramatic. It's repetitive, cautious, and more often than not, boring. Most days wouldn't feel like action scenes. They'd feel like a new routine built about avoiding the small mistakes we committed when comfortable. Priorities will change from, I need to pay my bills, I need a good grade on school, or I need to find a job, and become, I need to ration food, I can't make any unnecessary noise, and I must survive. Pretty good trade-off, honestly. And if you think physical survival is the hardest part, the mental adjustment is where people really start to fall apart, destroying others and themselves. Psychology. A post-nuclear world wouldn't just damage infrastructure. It would slowly rewire how people think, how people act, and how people live. Fear wouldn't stay intense forever. Over time, it would fade into the background. It will become the expectation for every situation. And that is the most dangerous factor. The expectation of fear becomes a thread. Death would stop being shocking and start feeling inconvenient. Violence wouldn't always provoke outrage, just exhaustion. Actions that would be considered extreme become part of the routine. People would stop thinking long-term because long-term thinking assumes stability. Decisions would shrink down to today, hoping they can live to see tomorrow. Trust would erode quietly. Even within close groups, suspicion would grow and paranoia would install in everyone's mind. People would start doubting everything from everyone, questioning if they can really trust anyone. Human beings are not built to live with constant uncertainty. No one is. This feeling would create uncertainty, tension, and distress amongst people, no matter how close they were before the apocalypse. Communities wouldn't just collapse. They would break and reform in a much darker, violent way. And this is where time itself starts making everything worse instead of better. The more it goes on, the more chaos will escalate. Time. This is where most people's mental image of survival completely falls apart. When presented with dangerous situations or unfortunate events, people are quick to ask, how long will it go on? Humans are anxious, especially in our current society, and so the wait for a solution would be asked endlessly because of fear and comfort on a countdown to the end. In a post-nuclear world, time does the opposite. Every day that passes takes more and more hope with it, breaking the spirit and hopes of the people who, though the situation could be resolved passively. There's no resupply, no replacement parts, no quiet factory somewhere producing what you need. When something breaks, it stays broken, and no one will come fix it for you. Cars don't get repaired, they become shelters or scrap. Buildings don't get maintained, they rot. Tools wear down slowly until one day they just don't work anymore. And with that comes even more anxiety. Humans aren't prepared for such a precarious and dire situation. People will expect quick fixes and passive resolution, waiting until the last second for normality once more. You can work harder every single day and still be worse off than last month. That messes with people in a deep way. Improvement won't be easy and quantifiable anymore. It'll be quiet, invisible, and frustrating. Hope will linger, for it is the only thing people can still hold on to with ease. But as the days go by, hope will become a waste of time and energy, becoming an obstacle for true survival. At first, people make elaborate plans for what to do, thinking months ahead. But with time, the expectation of survival will decrease in such a way that thinking about tomorrow will become a dream. And when planning disappears, the future becomes just a dream. Motivation is made as simple as natural survival, living just because that's what our body is supposed to do, and nothing else. And just when you think the situation has hit rock bottom, the most fragile system of all collapses next. Medicine. A nuclear apocalypse wouldn't kill most people in dramatic ways. Death would linger in the most mundane, boring, and unexpected ways. Small infections, untreated illnesses, minor injuries that just won't heal correctly. Modern medicine has made people think that a small bruise, cut, or a simple fever is just a nuisance. But in an apocalypse, all of these become life-threatening problems. They become priorities. Without antibiotics, a simple cut can turn fatal. Without a band-aid, a small cut can turn into a deadly infection. And a simple fever will slowly take away your strength, then your energy, and at the end, your life. Hospitals wouldn't function, not because doctors disappear, but because hospitals rely on electricity, clean water, sterile equipment, staff coordination, and supply chains. Remove any one of those and the system struggles. Remove all of them, and it collapses completely. At that point, medicine turns into guesswork. People wouldn't die screaming most of the time. They'd get weaker, more tired, and slowly stop recovering from things they used to shrug off. And here's the uncomfortable part. A lot of those deaths wouldn't look urgent. People would delay treatment because everything feels urgent. By the time they realize something is wrong, it's already too late. This is one of the least talked about aspects of nuclear collapse, probably because it's not exciting and it doesn't look like a movie, but it would quietly remove huge portions of the population. At that point, medical care becomes more like, okay, don't touch anything sharp, don't get sick, and definitely don't trip, because gravity is suddenly a much bigger threat than it used to be. And even if you somehow stay physically healthy, the mental strain doesn't ease up. The mind. Living long-term in a post-nuclear world would slowly reshape how people think, and not in some dramatic or cinematic way that's easy to notice at first. Fear wouldn't stay intense forever, because the human brain can't survive in constant panic. Instead, it would become a steady background presence, and constant fear ends up changing behavior far more than panic ever could. Death would also stop feeling shocking after a while. You wouldn't have the emotional energy to react deeply every time someone doesn't make it, even if you cared about them once. People would start categorizing losses instead of fully mourning them. This one was unavoidable. That one was stupid. This one was just bad luck. That kind of emotional distancing is a survival mechanism, and in the short term it helps people keep functioning. But it always comes with a cost. Empathy slowly shrinks. Patience wears thin, and small frustrations start to feel enormous because there's no real outlet left for stress anymore. People become more impulsive, more suspicious, and much less forgiving, not because they want to be, but because there's no emotional margin left. Trust becomes conditional and temporary. You don't trust people because they're good. You trust them because, at least for now, their interests align with yours. And once those interests change, the trust disappears just as quickly. This is how groups begin to split without anyone fully realizing it's happening until it's already too late. And if you think that emotional pressure would ease once people adjust to this kind of life, you might think that was bad, but you're wrong. Society wouldn't vanish overnight, but it also wouldn't stay recognizable for very long. long. Instead of collapsing cleanly, it would slowly twist into something unstable and inconsistent. Money would lose its meaning surprisingly fast. Paper currency only works when there's actually something to buy, and once shelves stay empty and trade becomes unreliable, cash turns into just paper people argue over. Value would shift toward things that actually keep you alive. Food, practical skills, tools that still work, protection, and reliable information. What you have and what you know would matter far more than what you own on paper. Leadership wouldn't naturally rise from intelligence or ethics. More often, it would fall into the hands of people who sound confident, decisive, and convincing enough to make others feel less afraid, even if they don't actually know what they're doing. Rules wouldn't disappear completely, but they'd be enforced unevenly and emotionally. Justice wouldn't feel fair or consistent anymore. It would become local, reactive, and heavily influenced by whoever holds power in that moment. And this is where things start getting genuinely uncomfortable. Instability doesn't just create chaos, it creates belief systems. People don't handle uncertainty well for long periods of time, so they start searching for explanations that make suffering feel intentional instead of random. When institutions disappear, stories take their place. People cling to narratives that explain why things went wrong and what needs to happen next. Some of those stories would be harmless, almost comforting. Others would be rigid, extreme, and dangerous. Cults, extreme ideologies, and hard belief systems would spread quickly, not necessarily because people are stupid, but because certainty feels safer than living in constant fear. And once someone commits deeply enough to a belief, logic stops being persuasive. At that point, the belief isn't about truth anymore. It's about emotional survival, normalization. Humans have an unsettling ability to adapt to almost anything, including conditions they never should have had to accept in the first place. What feels unbearable at first slowly becomes routine, and what once felt shocking eventually turns into something expected and almost boring. People wouldn't wake up every morning thinking, "This is horrible and I can't live like this." They'd wake up thinking, "Okay, what do we have to deal with today?" And then just deal with it. That kind of normalization is dangerous because it quietly lowers the bar for everything without anyone really noticing it happening. Violence starts to feel tolerable. Loss becomes something people learn how to manage, and suffering fades into the background as a kind of constant noise you stop reacting to. You might think that level of psychological damage would completely break people in a permanent and obvious way. You might think that was bad, but you're wrong, because the real damage doesn't always show up immediately. It often appears later in the next generation, shaped by an environment where all of this already feels normal. And once you really look at how the environment and future generations are affected, the idea of rebuilding starts to feel very different. Environment. When people imagine the world after a nuclear apocalypse, they usually picture two extremes. Either everything is a radioactive wasteland forever, or nature magically heals and thrives once humans are gone. Both of those ideas are wrong, and the real version is much messier. The environment wouldn't collapse all at once. It would become unpredictable, radiation wouldn't spread evenly, some places would be dangerously contaminated, while others would seem completely fine at first. That unevenness is what makes it dangerous. You wouldn't always know which water sources are unsafe. You wouldn't always know which soil is slowly poisoning crops. Some effects would take years to show up. That means people wouldn't avoid danger. They'd live in it without realizing. And unlike an obvious threat, invisible danger is hard to respect for long periods of time. People relax. They take shortcuts. They assume it'll be fine. Sometimes it wouldn't be fine. Weather patterns would also start acting strangely. Nuclear fallout can reduce sunlight, lower temperatures, and disrupt growing seasons. That doesn't mean instant global freezing, but it does mean less reliable food production. Crops that used to grow easily would fail more often, and once food becomes inconsistent, survival starts depending more on luck than effort. Animals wouldn't simply take over either. Ecosystems are fragile, and radiation doesn't selectively target humans. Some species would decline, others might surge temporarily. Balance would disappear. People love the idea of nature reclaiming cities, but the reality would look more like struggling ecosystems trying to function under stress they were never built to handle. And once the environment stops cooperating, survival turns into something much more generational. Generations. This is one of the most overlooked parts of nuclear apocalypse scenarios. People focus on survivors, but they don't think enough about children. Children born after the collapse wouldn't mourn the old world. They wouldn't miss electricity, the internet, or modern medicine, because they never knew them. What feels unbearable to survivors would feel normal to them. That gap creates tension. Older generations would grieve constantly. Younger ones would adapt without emotional attachment. That difference alone would cause conflict. Stories about the past would sound exaggerated, even unbelievable. You used to talk to anyone in the world instantly? Food came from buildings with bright lights? People trusted water straight from the wall? Over time, facts would blur into myths. Technology would become legend. Knowledge would distort as it's passed down without infrastructure to support it. And while humans are incredibly adaptable, progress requires continuity. You don't rebuild civilization with creativity alone. You rebuild it with records, education, and stable transmission of knowledge. Nuclear collapse shatters that chain. So, instead of a clear path forward, you'd get pockets of partial understanding. Some groups rediscovering skills, others losing them completely. History wouldn't reset, it would fracture. Explaining a smartphone at that point would sound like, yeah, so this tiny rectangle used to contain the entire world, which honestly sounds made up even now. And when people finally start thinking seriously about rebuilding, things get uncomfortable fast. Rebuilding. Rebuilding sounds hopeful and optimistic, and that's exactly why people like talking about it, because it feels like a clean solution to something that otherwise feels overwhelming and impossible. The reality, though, is a lot less inspiring once you actually slow down and think about what rebuilding would require in a world like this. Rebuilding assumes cooperation, shared goals, and long-term stability. But a nuclear apocalypse world wouldn't offer any of those things consistently, especially not when resources are scarce and trust is already fractured. People wouldn't even agree on what rebuilding is supposed to look like. Some would want to recreate the old systems as closely as possible, believing that returning to what once worked is the safest option, while others would see those same systems as the reason everything collapsed in the first place. That disagreement alone would be enough to slow progress to a crawl, because every major decision would turn into an argument about the past instead of a plan for the future. Resources would also be limited from the start, and conflicts over land, water, and food wouldn't magically disappear just because people want peace or understand that cooperation would be better in theory. On top of that, rebuilding infrastructure without industrial support is painfully slow. There would be no factories mass-producing parts, no reliable logistics networks to move supplies efficiently, and no stable power systems to keep everything running long-term. Every small improvement would take years of effort, and every setback could erase decades of progress in a single moment, which is the part people usually don't like acknowledging. Human history already shows us that collapse is common while recovery is rare. Entire civilizations have disappeared before without anything remotely close to nuclear weapons involved. When you add radiation, environmental damage, and fractured knowledge into the mix, rebuilding doesn't become more heroic, it becomes significantly harder. At some point, rebuilding society stops sounding ambitious and starts sounding more like, okay, but can we please stop dismantling the last functional thing we own? It's a low bar, but apparently still a difficult one to clear. And underneath all of this sits the part people tend to avoid thinking about entirely: memory. Memory is fragile, especially in a world without reliable systems designed to preserve it over time. Books decay, digital storage becomes useless without consistent power, and oral history slowly shifts and mutates as it's passed from one person to the next. Over time, small details disappear first, then the context behind them fades, and eventually, even the original meaning is lost. People wouldn't clearly remember how fragile the pre-apocalypse world actually was, because what survives in memory are usually the highlights, not the warning signs. That kind of selective memory creates a dangerous form of nostalgia that feels comforting but hides a lot of inconvenient truths. Future societies might idealize the past without truly understanding how it functioned, copying surface-level structures while completely missing what actually made them work. Mistakes would end up repeating themselves, not because people are stupid or careless, but because the memory they're working with is incomplete. And when those lessons vanish, history doesn't warn you anymore. It simply happens again, often in ways people don't see coming. And this is why the scariest part still isn't the bomb itself, but what it slowly forces humanity to become afterward, the reality. After thinking through survival, time, medicine, psychology, society, the environment, and future generations, something genuinely uncomfortable starts to become clear if you sit with it long enough. The nuclear apocalypse isn't terrifying just because of how violent or destructive it is in the moment. It's terrifying because of how quiet it slowly becomes once that initial shock wears off. After the chaos fades, there's no constant action to react to, no dramatic music swelling in the background, and no clear enemy you can point at and fight. There is just routine. And routine is where the real damage settles in. People wake up each day, check what supplies are left, decide which risks feel acceptable for that moment, eat whatever is available, fix what can still be fixed, and avoid anything that feels even slightly dangerous. And then they repeat that exact process over and over again, sometimes for years, without any clear sense of progress. The real horror isn't intensity or spectacle, it's duration. Humans are surprisingly good at surviving short-term disasters where adrenaline and urgency push us forward, but long-term collapse is what slowly breaks people down. That happens because there's no finish line waiting at the end. There's no clear moment where things obviously start getting better or where the suffering begins to feel justified by improvement. Life doesn't feel heroic enough to give meaning to everything you're enduring, but it's also not bad enough to end decisively. It just continues. And that strange in-between space is brutal in a way that's hard to put into words. This is also the part that makes movies and games feel almost dishonest by comparison. Endurance. Most apocalypse stories focus on either the beginning or the very end of everything. They show the collapse in dramatic detail or jump ahead to rebuilding and hope, but they usually skip the middle entirely. And the middle is where people actually live, struggle, and slowly wear down. Endurance is waking up every day knowing that nothing is coming to save you, and still having to make decisions anyway because not choosing is also a choice. You don't get rewarded just for trying, and you don't get punished in any consistent or fair way either. Most of the time, things simply happen with no clear reason attached. Bad outcomes don't always come from bad choices, and making the right choice doesn't guarantee safety in a world like this. That kind of randomness slowly eats away at people's sense of control. Humans need feedback. We need to feel like our actions matter, and when cause and effect start breaking down, motivation usually disappears right after. That's why so many people wouldn't actually die from starvation or violence. They'd just stop trying, not all at once, and not in some dramatic moment either, but quietly and over time. They'd take more risks, skip precautions, and stop fixing small problems early, even when they know better. Not because they want to die, but because effort eventually stops feeling meaningful. That's one of the hardest things to fight in a collapsed world, and it rarely gets talked about. At some point, survival isn't even about bravery anymore. It becomes about convincing yourself to care that a leaky roof will turn into a serious problem later. Very inspiring stuff. And this is where the idea of human resilience often gets misunderstood. Boredom. Boredom doesn't sound dangerous, which is exactly why people underestimate it in almost every apocalypse scenario. When everything first collapses, there's chaos, fear, and adrenaline pushing people forward. But once things settle into a routine, boredom starts filling the gaps, and it does it quietly. There's only so much time you can spend scavenging, repairing, guarding, or planning before entire days start feeling identical. No new information, no entertainment, no distractions. Just long stretches of time where nothing happens and your brain has nowhere to go. That kind of boredom doesn't feel relaxing. It feels restless and uncomfortable, like your mind is pacing back and forth with no exit. And people are very bad at sitting with that feeling. Boredom makes people take risks they wouldn't otherwise take, just to feel something different. They wander farther, poke at things they should leave alone, or start conflicts that don't actually matter. Sometimes it's not hunger or desperation that causes dangerous decisions. It's the need to break the monotony. People start telling the same stories over and over again. Arguments resurface not because they're important, but because there's nothing new to replace them. Small annoyances grow into major conflicts simply because there's no distraction to dilute them. And over time, boredom becomes corrosive. It chips away at motivation, curiosity, and patience, making survival feel less like a challenge and more like an endless loop you're trapped inside. That's the part nobody really prepares for. Adaptation. People love saying humans are adaptable, and that's true. But adaptation isn't always positive. People adapt to violence. They adapt to inequality. They adapt to loss. Adapting just means adjusting expectations. Over time, standards drop. What would once be unacceptable becomes normal. What used to cause outrage barely registers. That doesn't mean people become monsters. It means they recalibrate. And that recalibration is permanent for anyone who grows up in it. Children raised in a post-nuclear world wouldn't see their lives as tragic. They'd just see them as life. Danger wouldn't feel dramatic to them. It would feel expected. That's unsettling, because it means humanity continues, but changed. The apocalypse doesn't end the species. It reshapes it. And once you accept that, the final question changes completely. Control. The real fear behind nuclear apocalypse isn't extinction. It's loss of control. Modern life quietly makes us dependent on systems we don't think about. Electricity, logistics, medicine, communication. When those systems vanish, so does predictability. Suddenly, survival depends heavily on luck, location, and timing. You can do everything right and still fail. Someone else can make terrible choices and survive longer by chance. That randomness strips meaning from effort, and humans hate randomness more than hardship. That's why nuclear apocalypse is so psychologically disturbing. It doesn't just threaten life, it threatens the idea that life makes sense. Nothing like realizing the most important survival skill is being in the right place at the right time. Very fair system. 10 out of 10. And this is why the bomb itself isn't the real ending. Meaning, at some point, survival alone stops answering the question people are really asking. In the beginning, staying alive is enough. It feels urgent, justified, and obvious. But once survival becomes routine, meaning starts quietly slipping away. People don't usually notice it happening at first. They wake up, do what needs to be done, go to sleep, and repeat until one day they realize they're still alive, but don't really know why anymore. Big ideas don't survive very well in a post-nuclear world. There's no room for long-term dreams when the future feels fragile and unpredictable. Instead, meaning shrinks. It becomes personal, specific, and sometimes painfully small. Keeping someone else alive, protecting a place, fixing the same object one more time, making tomorrow slightly easier than today. For some people, that's enough. For others, it isn't. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because meaning can't be standardized or enforced. You can't ration it, trade it, or rebuild it the way you do with infrastructure. Once people lose a sense of meaning, survival turns into obligation instead of choice. They keep going because stopping would be worse, not because continuing feels purposeful. And that kind of existence doesn't explode or collapse dramatically. It just drags on, which is why when people imagine nuclear apocalypses, they usually focus on destruction. But the real challenge isn't surviving the end of the world. It's figuring out why you'd want to survive what comes after. The bomb itself is an event, something sudden and violent that happens in a moment. The aftermath, though, is a condition, and conditions don't end neatly or give you any sense of closure. They drag on for years, blur entire generations together, and slowly turn real history into rumor and advanced technology into something closer to folklore. The world wouldn't explode and then simply disappear. It would limp forward instead, damaged and uneven, feeling familiar in some places and completely alien in others. People would still laugh sometimes, still fall in love, and still find ways to argue over stupid things that don't really matter in the grand scheme. Life wouldn't actually stop. It would just start costing more. Emotionally, physically, and mentally, every ordinary moment would demand more than it used to. And that's the part people don't like sitting with for too long. Because once you really think about it, the nuclear apocalypse isn't actually about destruction. It's about endurance without meaning. If you enjoyed this video and want to see everything you haven't considered about zombie apocalypses, click the video on screen now.